Hello and welcome to episode 23 of the Teacher's Tea Time podcast. My name is Mark and I hope you're doing well. This podcast is about, by and for anyone who has ever had anything to do with schools and education. That's probably almost everybody. Topics and content in this podcast are listener generated. They come from listeners just like yourself. We are proud to be a member of Adjacent, a design collaborative made up of educators who dream of a better world for our students and their teachers. Learn more at adjacent.org. I have a mug of tea ready, so let's sit back, relax, and get on with the show. In today's episode, we take our first periodical dive into the history of education. In one of the courses I teach, we do a unit about the history of public education in the United States. And I get asked lots of questions by my students about education in other places and at other times. As a result, it's only fitting to use this podcast as an excuse to find out more. So today, we're going to go back in time, way back to the dawn of civilization, to find out if there was any formal education in the ancient world. And, if there was it much different to what we do today? Let's first get a bearing on what we know about humankind's early origins. We know that Homo sapiens, our species, lived a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, moving seasonally to follow food sources. We know this because we have archaeological evidence, and archaeologists and anthropologists are smart people and very good at working these things out. We don't know for sure how these societies are constructed, or who did what, as they didn't write anything down. Indeed, these societies are considered prehistoric because history is often attributed to a written record of some sort. And that's really the difference between what's historical and what's prehistorical. Is there written evidence? However, what we can surmise from the anthropological examination of modern-day societies who lived a similar lifestyle is that these early hunter-gatherer societies were tribal. They were made up of extended family groups. And it is likely that these were matriarchal. And this makes sense, particularly if males were hunting, there was a high risk of those men getting injured or worse, and this would leave a vacuum of power and decision-making, whereas a matriarch could always direct the family or tribe with less risk. This means that children had to learn how to survive. That means how to hunt and gather, what to hunt and what to gather, what food to eat, what seeds would kill you, what fruits were good. They had to know how to make tools, how to cook, how to use fire, what to eat, how to care for infants, how to ensure that the tribe was successful in any other way you can imagine. We do assume that there was no schooling as we imagine it, but we can also assume that children learned what was important from their elders. With no formal writing, knowledge was passed on verbally, through storytelling and music, and that a lot of that knowledge was dependent on tribal elders passing it on. Children learned their skills by helping adult family members, eventually being good enough to do things on their own. Learning was the key to survival and development of tribal societies. So, although not formal like we'd recognise it, education was important for societies to survive, even in prehistoric times. Now, Homo sapiens lived in this Paleolithic lifestyle for about 2.6 million years. And then about 10,000 years ago, things changed. The planet began to warm up. And this ended the last great ice age. And in certain areas, usually around river valleys, wild grasses began to grow in abundance. And it was in these areas that we see the first permanent settlements begin, as people stayed and they started to harvest these crops. Areas such as Mesopotamia, that's modern-day Iraq between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, or around the Yellow River in China, or the Nile River Valley in modern-day Egypt, or the Indus River Valley in India. And there's parts of Mexico and South America where we all witness these similar developments. Local grasses were not only cultivated, but they were farmed and used to make new foodstuffs. In Mesopotamia, wheat was cultivated to make both bread and beer. In China, it was rice. In Mesoamerica, it was maize. Once humans stopped moving to follow their food, they also penned in, we call that domesticated, animals for food too. So we start to get the first farms in these early civilizations. So, with an abundance of food, usually, not everyone had to focus their energy on the survival of the family or the tribe and their role in finding food. So we now had time for more specialization and an apparent need to get society organized so people could specialize in what they were good at. We also start to see the development of writing, primarily to track the resources. And we see different skills emerge: pottery, carpentry, artists, architects, and we see the formalization of religion. And this is important, as it was those who could predict how and when these river valleys would flood who had the power. Remember, floods were important. Floods fertilized the soil, and they were regular, and they were predictable. And if you kept a calendar, you were important because you could plot time by looking at the stars. So astronomy is important. And you could explain to people when to plant, when to sow, and when to reap. This was crucial. This was specific, and it was learned knowledge. And so it was that those who learned it were the first rulers in those early settlements. And so it follows that in these early civilizations, the ability to write became a key skill. Writing equals resource management equals power. Therefore, those who controlled knowledge controlled resources and therefore wielded power. Also, because things were now written down, we have an historical record that we can examine. So not only is it cool that these civilizations invented writing, and this invented history, but they also recorded how people were taught to write. And these were the first examples of a formal education process. Therefore, the first schools, as we would imagine them in a modern context, emerged around 7,000 years ago in these early settlements, in these early river valley civilizations, around about the same time, all around the world. Perhaps one of the most well-known examples of a formal education system in the ancient world comes from ancient Mesopotamia in the city of Sumer. According to Scott Rank, who does the History Unplugged podcast, the invention of writing made kings and priests realize the need for educating scribes. At first, the writing was simple pictograms, but it gradually developed into cuneiform, which were wedge-shaped marks inscribed onto clay. Wedge shapes were due to the triangle-shaped tip of the stylus, a reed used as a pen. With the invention of writing, the Sumerians began to record everything they saw: business, inventories, observations of daily life, religious hymns, poems, stories, palace orders, and temple records. We know that it took about 12 years to learn the cuneiform marks and the general knowledge of the scribes. We know this because it was written down. Temples established schools in which to educate boys and scribes as priests. At first, scribal schools were aligned with the temples, but gradually secular schools took over. So what happened was established scribes would open up schools and charge tuition to teach new scribes. Now, tuition made sure that only the boys of wealthy families could afford to acquire any level of education. The sons of the nobility, government officials, priests, and rich merchants all went to school. Learning cuneiform was difficult, so it's assumed that a few Sumerians were literate, although they could probably recognize some common words. Now we have evidence that boys started school at 7 or 8 years old. Rich girls only went to school if they were the daughters of kings or they were training to be priestesses. Teachers were usually former scribes or they were priests, and priests had been taught to be scribes. So we're making an assumption that they too were male. We also know that discipline was harsh by modern standards. We have evidence of students being whipped or beaten for speaking at the wrong time or without permission, leaving the classroom without permission, or not dressing appropriately. Now, cuneiform was practiced on clay tablets, and students learned as much as they could about history, geography, zoology, botany, astronomy, medicine, and architecture. Any knowledge that could be written down was learned in schools. We have evidence of clay tablets with students' writings and teachers' corrections on them. And there are sources that tell us how scribes, once they finished school, could become priests. Remember, this was a powerful position, or scribes for the military, or scribes for the palace, or scribes in the temple, or scribes for private businesses. Learning to read and write was the key to a successful civilization in Mesopotamia. It was also the key to social advancement. Now, not far away in the Nile River Valley, civilization was also developing in what we now call ancient Egypt. There we have similar records of a formal education that we can recognize as akin to what we have today. There are images depicting a classroom where students sit in rows of desks, with a teacher at the front at a larger desk. We know that there were school books on subjects such as reading, writing and math. And we also know that, like Mesopotamia, boys began schooling at around 7 years of age. We think the schools in Egypt were more affordable than in Mesopotamia, as there is evidence of middle-class boys going to school until they were 14, then leaving to learn their parents' trade as an apprentice. Some girls also attended school, particularly if they were higher born and may need to know how to scribe so they can help with their family businesses. As in Mesopotamia, it was the ability to scribe that provided the most opportunity. Scribes went into business, medicine, the priesthood, politics, and law. There is evidence of women having positions as doctors, although this is rare. Philosophy, religion, and morals were all taught together. They were considered inseparable as subjects. Rules for behaviour were written on the classroom walls, and punishments for breaking rules would be considered as harsh by today's standards. We also know that there were different schools for different social classes. For example, children in the royal household attended a prince's school, no doubt grooming them for future leadership. Perhaps the biggest difference between ancient Mesopotamia and Egyptian education was the media by which information was recorded. Whereas in Mesopotamia writing was on clay tablets in cuneiform, in Egypt papyrus was used, and writing was in the form of a hieroglyph written with reed pens and ink. Perhaps it's this evolution that allowed for the expansion of formal education to more than the children of the elite. When we think about formal education, there are quite a few similarities between what we do today in the 21st century and what was happening in the ancient world. For a start, the question of what do children need to know and do has always been at the heart of learning, whether it be in a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer society or a more organised early River Valley civilization. Moreover, the key focus of education, learning to convey information, focused on the ability to write and express oneself, that still resonates today, and we really value how we can communicate as individuals. We can also recognise a Sumerian or an Egyptian school with its rows of desks and authoritative teacher. That mirrors some of our own practices today. Furthermore, when we consider what students were disciplined for, speaking at the wrong time, getting out of their seat, and dress code violations, you'd be forgiven for asking yourself if anything has changed over time. I couldn't help noticing some other themes that emerged just from these two civilizations. For example, the inequality of women in education and the inequities of access to education. Remember, it cost money to go to school, and only the richest could afford the best education for social mobility. And there's another connection. Education afforded social mobility. Education also was necessary for society to survive. And then one of those things with education is the technology drives it. So we've got cuneiform on clay tablets and we've got papyrus and writing as ways of conveying and transmitting that information and practicing learning. So I reckon this idea of social mobility, education for society and technology, they're going to be themes that I predict will continue to resonate as we learn more about the history of education. As we learn more in this series about how education developed over time, I challenge you to ask yourself, what is it that we do so differently today? And then take that thought process a little further. If we do things that are so similar to what people did thousands of years ago, are we actually doing what is best for our children, considering we're supposed to know more than they do? So the next time we revisit this series of the history of education, we're going to find out about other ancient River Valley societies. And as we learn about them, I challenge you to ask yourself, what is it that we do so differently today? Then, take that thought process further. What is it that we should be doing for children today? And I'm going to let you ruminate on that yourselves. But until then, that was episode 23 of the Teachers Tea Time podcast. And this podcast is a proud member of Adjacent, a design collaborative made up of educators who dream of a better world for our students and their teachers. We create, write, talk, teach, learn, and coach about the things that matter most in education. To find out more, point your browser to www.adjacent.org. That's www.edjacent.org. For me, it's the stories of teachers, students, and school communities that matter. As such, this podcast is only possible with the help and support of its listeners. Please leave positive reviews wherever you are able. If you're an iTunes or Spotify subscriber, leaving a good review can really help our visibility. Also, please don't keep this podcast to yourself. Tell your friends to subscribe and listen too. One thing we all have in common is that we've been to school. So if you'd like to contribute to the pod in any way, if you have stories to share, long, short, tragic or comic, if you have comments you want to make about the podcast or just want to say hi, you can send an email to teachersteatimpod@gmail.com. Alternatively, you can send emails to me directly using mark@adjacent.org. I love to read what you have to say. If social media is your thing, you can follow me directly on Twitter @MarkDearcop. You can find our contact information, copies of the show notes, and you can download previous episodes of the podcast at www.teachersteatimepod.com. The podcast artwork was created by Phaedra. Opening and closing music is by Brian Boyko. It's been my pleasure to be your host today. Thank you for listening.